Hello, Betty. What's the problem? I haven't got a problem. I've got fucking problems. Plural. Wanna hear?
Sure.
This is Margaret Prescott, host of Sojourner Truth. This past Saturday marked the 6-year anniversary of the Fukushima Daiichi disaster, the largest nuclear disaster in a quarter of a century, the worst since Chernobyl in 1986. The disaster took place on March 11th, 2011. Northeastern Japan was hit by a massive earthquake, 9.0. Then a tsunami, destructive tsunami, followed, wiping out towns one by one. And then in the aftermath, 3 reactors at the nuclear power station melted down. More than 15,000 people died, more than 6,000 were injured, and many more forced to flee their homes. Now, at the end of this month, the Japanese government is set to lift the evacuation orders on some of the areas surrounding Fukushima. Now, since the disaster, there's been a lot of controversy around nuclear power plants. Germany made a move to end its dependence on nuclear power. France, actually, and the U.S. Increased dependence on nuclear power, or at least continue to build nuclear power. Good news for residents of California, where the Diablo Canyon nuclear power plant is due to close. The San Onofre power plant was shut down for good in 2013 as a result of faulty equipment that led to a small release of radioactive steam and a lot of protests leading to the closure of San Onofre. Now, here to discuss all of this with us, I'd like to welcome back to Sojourner Truth Kevin Camps. He is the radioactive waste watchdog at Beyond Nuclear, a leading U.S. anti-nuclear organization. He specializes in high-level waste management and transportation, new and existing reactors, climate change, and federal subsidies. Kevin, welcome back.
Hi, Margaret. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, Kevin, I think we actually caught up with you the day of the disaster at Fukushima. Now, of course, for people living in Japan who may have to return to the area surrounding Fukushima, they have concerns, and I'd like to hear your view on why they should be concerned. But also, people in the U.S. may not realize that the accident also had a reaction on the environment here in the United States. So why don't we start with that in terms of the reaction, the impact in the U.S.?
Well, the atmospheric releases during the first days and weeks of the Fukushima nuclear catastrophe had direct impacts on the United States. There were airborne releases that traveled across the Pacific Ocean with the prevailing winds and then fell as rain or snow in North America. So one of the data points that really stuck in my head was radioactive rainwater in Boise, Idaho in about mid-April of 2011 that measured about 250 times the Safe Drinking Water Act levels for radioactive iodine-131, which is a particularly vicious radioactive poison, one of the worst actors at both Fukushima and Chernobyl, for example. And that was just radioactivity traveling with the winds and then falling down. And actually in the state of Virginia, just days into the nuclear catastrophe, there was a warning from the state to residents of Virginia, don't drink rainwater. If you collect rainwater for drinking in a cistern, don't drink it until further notice. So it's this hodgepodge response by state and federal government in the United States that was very alarming, that they didn't even know how to handle it. And, the worst impacts, though, were close in Japan. That's where the radioactivity was the worst.
Right, and we'll be talking with nuclear expert Arnie Gunderson, too, as part of our coverage of the anniversary, which happened this past Saturday of the accident. Now, there were also reports of this cesium-134 which is referred to as a fingerprint of Fukushima. I mean, you mentioned the drinking water, but also looking at an article from December of 2016 that seawater samples taken from Tillamook Bay and Gold Beach in Oregon that is showing up there. And also it's been detected in Canadian salmon. So it
Yeah,
continues beyond what we initially saw after the
that,
accident.
that's another startling factoid about Fukushima is that by a couple years ago, the plume of radioactivity in seawater had come all the way across the Pacific, and to the point where a doubling of radioactive cesium, artificial cesium, radioactive cesium in seawater was detectable along the west coast of North America. So you take the other sources of artificial radioactivity in the Pacific from bomb test fallout that happened over the course of decades, routine so-called releases of radioactivity from the nuclear power industry into the ocean. You take all that, and Fukushima doubled it.
Mm.
So that's another impact. And then you mentioned the fish. That's a real concern, is the bioconcentration of radioactive poison in the seafood supply, and the top predator species are going to be the worst, and then of course humans eat those. So we knew as we found out on the first anniversary, so that would have been March of 2012, that scientists had detected radioactive cesium in bluefin tuna as early as August of 2011 off the west coast of North America. What had happened is, as young tuna, they were on the northeast coast of Japan. They had picked up contamination in their flesh, and then faster than even the currents or diffusion would carry it, these fish brought it all the way to the west coast of North America by swimming there. So radioactivity gets around. It's not a very big planet when it comes to a nuclear accident.
Yeah, so everybody out there eating sushi, who knows what contamination we're devouring here. Now, before we bring Arnie Gunderson into this discussion, Kevin, tell us first of all, the reaction in the U.S. in the nuclear industry. What impact did Fukushima have in looking at nuclear power as a solution for energy in the United States? And also, any concerns you have now with this new administration and the EPA?
Well, both in Japan and you mentioned Germany and even in the United States, Fukushima has had a huge impact on public perceptions and actions regarding nuclear power. So Arnie can speak more about it, but he played a key role, as did many folks, in the shutdown of San Onofre in 2013. And then just last September, Diablo Canyon, there was a deal hammered out between the company and environmental groups and labor unions and local communities to shut down Diablo Canyon instead of extending its license. That's not going to take place until 2024 or 2025. There's, record-breaking shutdowns of atomic reactors in the United States, and Arnie's had a major hand in a number of those. So Fukushima put nuclear power back on a lot of people's radar screens, that the safety risks are just not worth it. There are other sources of electricity that happen to be cleaner and cheaper and just as reliable, so why aren't we using them? And Germany is leading the world in that regard.
All right. Okay. So, Kevin, thank you for that. And we're going to be continuing to follow this. A lot of environmental concerns. There's a March of Scientists coming up in April, I believe, on Washington, D.C. And who knows what we're going to be facing in the future. So we appreciate you joining us, Kevin Camps. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
This is Margaret Prescott, host of Sojourner Truth, and we are marking the 6-year anniversary of the Fukushima disaster, the largest nuclear disaster in a quarter of a century since Chernobyl. Chernobyl was 1986. I'd like to welcome back to Sojourner Truth a man who really, in the period after Fukushima, was regularly on our show helping us to understand what is going on. Arnie Gunderson, nuclear power expert, holds a nuclear safety patent, was a licensed reactor operator, a former nuclear industry senior vice president, and Arnie also managed and coordinated projects at 70 nuclear power plants in the United States. And in February and March of last year, Arnie worked in Japan teaching scientists and citizen scientists how to collect accurate radiation data and more. Arnie, welcome back.
Hey, Margaret. Thank you for having me again. It's nice to hear your voice.
Okay, so Arnie, Kevin talked about the key role that you have been playing since the accident. Of course, you played a key role prior to the accident. Tell us something about the work that you were doing in Japan itself.
Well, first off, I'm trying to remove from my lexicon the word accident. An accident is when an owl hits your windshield in the middle of the night and totally unforeseeable. A disaster is one that is foreseeable, and that's what we really have in Fukushima. When you build a 12-foot tsunami wall and you know that 50-foot tsunamis can occur, that's not an accident. That's a disaster. When I was over there, it was amazing. The inhumanity of the Japanese government and Tokyo Electric to their own citizens. My biggest takeaway is that radiation's everywhere, and I ran into doctors who were deliberately and knowingly distorting the medical records of people. I had a woman whose hair fell out. She had a bloody nose for 2 months, and she had splotches all over her body, and she lived about 3 miles from the reactor. And her doctor wrote it up as stress. So, as being a scientist, if I ever try to go back and find out, what illnesses were caused by the disaster, it's very hard to find medical records that haven't been doctored by the doctors. We had one doctor who was actually put out of business because he refused to do that. He put radiation on their on the medical forms, and the government refused to reimburse him for his services. So the epidemiological record is being totally misconstrued by the nuclear industry. And it's very difficult now as a scientist to go back and try to recreate what actually happened.
Right. And, of course, the several hundred people plan to move back as soon as April to the area surrounding Fukushima. But 53% of former residents, according to a government poll taken last fall, they don't want to return. And a lot of people are afraid to return. Should they be?
Oh, absolutely. They're in a situation where damned if they do and damned if they don't. What's happening is the people that moved out are having their stipends withdrawn unless they move home. So, they can't live away because they're losing money, and the only way to retain that income is to move back into a contaminated zone. What I found, I took hundreds of samples, and we're working on a scientific paper, and it takes time, but radiation's everywhere. I found it at, I went into convenience stores, 7-Elevens, and the floor mat, I would sample the floor mat, and it's loaded with radioactivity. This is in areas where people live. I even found radiation in Tokyo, significant radiation. I mean, if it was in the United States, it would have to go to a radioactive waste dump. And this was in the flower pot right outside of Japan's Atomic Energy Commission. They call it METI. And here we are. We're going to have the Olympics in 2020, and the whole country is contaminated. It's serious, and but cancers don't start until about 10 years out. So everybody can ignore the problem, with the exception of thyroid. There's been a noticeably statistically meaningful increase in thyroid cancers, which happen very quickly. But all the other cancers are years out, and so. Don't worry, be happy. They're gonna try to get more plants online, and then mask the health effects by distorting the records.
Yeah, and just remarkable. I mean, looking at some of the data at the site, 400 tons of contaminated water created every day. The process of decontaminating that water, creating more than 3,500 containers of radioactive sludge, and more. But that's according to the New York Times. But also, Arnie, have you heard this story recently about populations of wild animals, including radioactive wild boars, booming in the area around Fukushima?
Well, the population is growing because there's no natural predators. It's interesting. One of the hunters gave me some wild boar meat while I was over there, and I put my Geiger counter on it, and oh my God, it was highly contaminated. These, and I also chased radioactive monkeys through the forests and measured their poop, and I walked out on fields where there were cattle and measured the cow plop and stuff like that. That it's in the intestinal tracts, it's in the meat and the organs of all these animals. And Dr. Tim Mousseau is already finding abnormalities in some of the animals that reproduce quickly. Birds and insects and things like that.
Arnie, when something huge happens and the people's attention and the news focuses on it for some time. I mean, with this 6-year anniversary, I really didn't see a whole heck of a lot of coverage. But we still have to be concerned about the possibility of nuclear accidents. I mean, I'm looking at an article actually from today about Kentucky. I mean, with that in coal country, they are on the cusp of opening the door to nuclear power. The argument could be made of stopping the reliance on fossil fuel and people seeing nuclear power as some kind of clean alternative. But back, in Kentucky, they had a horrible situation with storing toxic waste. I think it was back in the 1960s and 1970s, where 800 corporations dumped millions of cubic feet of radioactive waste at a site. Nuclear reactor was never built. But what are your concerns now as this debate continues about nuclear power as an alternative, a kind of as ironic as it might sound, clean energy? Arnie Gunderson.
Yeah, that's a great question. There's two pieces to that. First is there's 99 operating nuclear reactors, and we're kidding ourselves if we think an accident can't happen here. We can have a disaster just like Fukushima Daiichi. Matter of fact, 24 of these reactors in the United States are identical to the Daiichi reactor. So to think that just because these plants have run for 30 years doesn't mean that tomorrow might not be a bad day is really wishful thinking. But the new reactors are so expensive that they make no sense. We did a 2-minute animation on the Fairewinds site, and if your listeners would like to go up Fairewinds, FAIREWINDS, and look up smokescreen, we talk exactly about what you're talking about. The cost to build a nuclear plant and the enormous time to build a nuclear plant actually makes global warming worse. And the reason is that that money could be better spent quicker and more. You could build more of it, solar or windmills or energy efficiency. So we'd be better spent instead of building a new generation of nukes for $10 trillion that would only solve about 10% of the problem and take 50 years to build. Instead of investing that $10 trillion in a 50-year project, you can build windmills and solar collectors right now to begin to bend the curve. Economists call it the opportunity cost. If you're going to spend money on one thing, that money is then tied up and you can't spend it on something else.
Yeah, and finally, you just have a minute or so, Arnie, but you mentioned the climate, the warming of the climate. I mean, we now have a EPA and somebody in the EPA who is a climate warming denier. What are your concerns now moving forward? As we still hope for wind and solar and clean energy, but a lot of people are very, very worried about what the future might look like, Arnie Gunderson.
Yeah, across the board, especially at the EPA, but across the board, we're seeing a war on truth and a war on fact and a war on science. And, truth and facts and science say that global warming is happening. And truth and facts and science would also support a whole bunch of other arguments, too. But the EPA is ignoring truth and fact and science to pursue a political agenda.
Right. Well, Arnie, quickly give your website so people can get information. And all the best to Margaret, who I know she works closely with you.
The website is Fairewinds, FAIREWINDS.org, and we're a 501c3 nonprofit, and there's lots of great stuff on the site.
Well, Arnie, come back soon. Thank you for joining us.